The storm came without warning. One moment the sky above the Varek settlement was pale and still, and the next it turned the color of ash. The wind arrived first, rushing through the tall trees that surrounded the settlement like something alive and angry. Then came the rain, heavy and cold, hammering the ground and bending the branches low. Thunder rolled across the hills in long, deep waves that shook the earth beneath every Varek foot. The Varek were a large and powerful people. They stood taller than most creatures in the wilderness, with broad shoulders, thick-scaled arms, and sharp eyes that could see clearly even in low light. They had survived many hard seasons in this land. They had faced droughts, floods, and bitter winters. They were not a people who frightened easily. But this storm was different. It moved faster than any storm the elders had ever seen. It came from the north and swept through the settlement like a great invisible hand sweeping everything sideways. Shelters cracked. Fire pits were drowned in seconds. The tall boundary trees that the Varek used as markers were snapped clean at the base. The sounds were overwhelming, wind screaming, wood breaking, rain striking stone like 1,000 small hammers all at once. The adult Varek moved quickly. They pulled one another inside. They secured the young ones they could find and pressed them into the deepest and most sheltered corners of their homes. Elder Mara, an old female with silver markings along her neck and steady hands that never shook, moved through the chaos calling out orders in a firm and clear voice. She had seen bad storms before. She knew what to do. But the young hatchlings who had been playing at the far edge of the settlement were not found in time. There were 7 of them. Small creatures, barely reaching an adult Varek's knee, with soft scales that had not yet hardened and wide curious eyes that saw everything as something to explore. They had been chasing each other through the tall grass near the eastern tree line when the storm hit. By the time anyone noticed they were missing, the wind was too strong to stand against and the rain too thick to see through. The storm lasted through the night and well into the next morning. When it finally passed and the sky turned a weak and watery gray, Elder Mara was already outside. She stood at the edge of the settlement and looked toward the tree line. The grass was flattened. Branches and debris covered the ground in every direction. The forest beyond the boundary looked dark and broken, full of fallen trees and deep shadow. She called for search parties immediately. 4 groups went out that first morning. They moved in different directions, calling the names of the hatchlings, following any trail they could find in the mud and the wet leaves. They searched through the entire day and came back at nightfall with nothing. No sign. No tracks that led anywhere useful. No sounds from the forest that answered their calls. They went out again the next day, and the day after that. On the 4th day, one of the scouts found a small patch of flattened grass and what looked like tiny claw marks on the bark of a broken tree. But the trail ended there. The rain had washed everything else away. There was nothing more to follow. Elder Mara stood before the settlement that evening and looked at the faces around her. She saw exhaustion. She saw grief beginning to settle in behind people's eyes like something heavy and permanent. She was old enough to know what that look meant. She had worn it herself once, many years ago, when the wilderness had taken something from her that she never got back. She spoke quietly. She told them they had done everything they could. She told them the wilderness was vast and the storm had been unlike anything in recent memory. She told them that the hatchlings had been declared lost, and that the settlement would grieve them properly and together. Some of the parents did not speak at all. They simply turned and walked back to their shelters with their heads low and their hands at their sides. A mother named Vera stood at the edge of the firelight for a long time, looking toward the dark tree line, before her sister gently took her arm and led her away. The settlement grew very quiet that night. Several miles away, on the other side of the forest, the wilderness ended at a narrow dirt path. And at the end of that path, half hidden by overgrown shrubs and an old leaning oak, sat a small cabin. It was not much to look at. The walls were rough timber, darkened by years of rain. The roof had a patch on one side where the original boards had rotted and been replaced. There was a single window facing the forest, a crooked chimney that still worked well enough, and a short wooden porch where a pair of old boots sat beside a stack of dry wood. Carl lived there alone. He was not a large man. He was lean and quiet, with rough hands and a habit of moving slowly and without noise, the way people do when they have spent a long time with only themselves for company. He had lived at the edge of that forest for several years, keeping to himself, doing small work when he needed supplies from the nearest town and returning to his cabin as quickly as he could. He did not bother the wilderness, and the wilderness, for the most part, did not bother him. The storm had hit his side of the forest hard. He had spent the night listening to the wind tear at his roof and watching the single candle on his table flicker and nearly die a dozen times. In the morning he stepped outside and spent several hours clearing fallen branches from around the cabin and checking that the roof patch had held. It was late in the afternoon, when the forest had gone still and the last of the wind had died completely, that he heard it. It was faint. So faint that at first he thought it was simply the sound of water still dripping from the trees. He stood on his porch and listened, his head slightly tilted, his eyes on the dark line of trees at the edge of his clearing. Then he heard it again. It was not water. It was something smaller and weaker than that. A sound like a thin cry, almost too quiet to follow, coming from somewhere deep inside the tree line. Carl set down the branch he was holding. He stood still for a moment, listening carefully. The sound came again, and this time he was sure. Something was out there. Something small. Something that was not doing well. He reached back inside the cabin doorway, picked up his old coat from the hook, and pulled it on. Then he stepped off the porch and walked toward the trees. Carl moved carefully through the broken forest. The storm had left the trees in a bad state. Branches hung at strange angles. Whole trunks lay across the ground, their roots pulled up from the earth in great dark masses. The ground beneath his boots was soft and wet, and every step made a quiet sucking sound as he moved deeper into the tree line. He followed the sound. It came in short bursts. A thin cry, then silence, then another cry slightly weaker than the one before. Carl kept his pace slow and steady. He did not call out. He did not want to frighten whatever was making the noise. He had lived near this forest long enough to know that frightened creatures sometimes ran deeper into danger when startled, and whatever was out here already sounded like it had very little strength left. The light inside the forest was low and gray. The clouds had not fully cleared and the tall trees blocked what pale light remained. Carl moved by feel as much as by sight, stepping over fallen branches and ducking beneath hanging wood, keeping the sound ahead of him and slightly to the left. He almost missed them. He had stepped around the wide base of a fallen oak, one of the largest trees he had ever seen brought down, and nearly moved past the dark hollow space beneath its massive trunk. Then he stopped. There, pressed together in a tight and shivering group beneath the fallen tree, were 7 small creatures. Carl had never seen anything like them. They were small, reaching perhaps no higher than his knee if they had been standing, which none of them were. They were curled tightly against one another, their small scaled bodies pressed together for warmth. Their scales were soft-looking, not hard like those of fully grown creatures, and several of them had patches of dried blood where branches or debris had cut into them during the storm. Their eyes, wide and dark, all turned toward him at once. For a long moment nobody moved. Carl crouched down slowly, bringing himself lower so that he was not looming over them. He kept his hands open and relaxed at his sides. He did not reach forward. He did not make any sudden movement. He simply stayed low and looked at them with the same quiet and steady expression he wore for most things in his life. One of the small creatures made a weak sound. Another pressed its face harder into the side of the one next to it. The smallest one, tucked into the very center of the group, was shaking more than the others. Carl exhaled slowly through his nose. They were cold. They were hurt. They had clearly been out here since the storm hit, which meant they had spent the entire night and most of the day in the wet and the wind beneath that tree. He did not know what they were or where they had come from. He did not need to know those things yet. What he could see clearly was that they needed help. He reached into the pocket of his coat and found a small piece of dried bread he had put there that morning and forgotten about. He broke off a tiny piece and set it on the ground in front of him, then pushed it gently forward with one finger. None of them moved toward it immediately. But the one closest to him lowered its nose and sniffed the air in his direction. Its eyes stayed on his face. Carl waited. After a long quiet moment, that same creature reached out one small clawed hand and took the piece of bread. It ate quickly, watching him the whole time. Carl broke off another small piece and set it down. Then another. He stayed crouched there for several minutes, moving nothing but his hand, letting them watch him, letting them decide for themselves that he was not a threat. By the time the bread was gone, two of them had crawled slightly forward out of the huddle. The shaking had not stopped, but it had slowed a little. Carl looked at the sky through the broken canopy above. The light was getting thinner. It would be dark soon, and the temperature would drop with it. He could not leave them here. He took off his coat. He spread it open on the ground in front of them and sat back on his heels. Then he waited again. It took a little time, but the cold did most of the work for him. One by one, drawn by the smell of warmth and something safe, the hatchlings crawled forward onto the coat. When all 7 were huddled on top of it, Carl folded the sides up gently around them and lifted the bundle carefully with both arms. He was surprised by how light they were. He carried them out of the forest slowly, watching his footing on the wet ground, keeping his arms steady so they would not be jostled. Several of them made small sounds against his chest. The smallest one pushed its head out from between the folds of the coat and looked up at his face for a moment before tucking back in. By the time he reached the cabin the sky was nearly dark. He brought them inside and set the coat bundle carefully on the floor near the fireplace. The fire had burned low while he was gone, but there were still coals. He built it back up quickly, feeding it dry wood from the stack beside the hearth until the flames were going properly and the room began to fill with warmth. Then he got to work. He filled a bowl with clean water and tore an old cloth shirt into strips. He unwrapped them one at a time and checked each wound carefully. Most of the cuts were not deep, just raw and dirty from the storm. He cleaned each one gently, working slowly and stopping whenever a hatchling flinched so that it could settle again before he continued. He had no medicine beyond what he kept for himself, but he had a small jar of drawing salve he used for splinters and cuts, and he applied a thin layer to the worst of the wounds. They let him do it. That was the thing that stayed with him. Not one of them bit him or scratched him or tried to pull away when he handled them. They watched his face while he worked, and whatever they saw there seemed to be enough for them to stay still. When he was done he found the warmest blanket he owned, an old thick wool one that had been his father's, and spread it out near the fire. He lifted them onto it one by one and arranged them so the smallest was in the middle where the warmth reached best. He heated a pot of simple broth, the kind he made for himself on cold evenings, and set it out in a shallow bowl to cool before placing it within their reach. They drank from it slowly at first, then more eagerly. Carl sat back against the wall and watched them. The fire popped quietly. Outside the wind had died completely and the forest was still. Inside the cabin the only sounds were the fire and the slow, settling breaths of 7 small creatures who had stopped shaking. The smallest one crawled across the blanket and pressed itself against Carl's side. He looked down at it for a moment. Then he let out a long breath, leaned his head back against the wall, and closed his eyes. Elder Mara did not sleep that night. She sat at the entrance of her shelter with a blanket across her shoulders and her eyes on the dark tree line at the edge of the settlement. The fire in the center of the settlement had burned down to a low orange glow. Everyone else had gone inside. The grief had settled over the settlement like a second storm, quieter than the first but heavier in every way that mattered. Mara was old. She had lived through more hard seasons than most Varek ever did. Her silver neck markings had once been bright, but they had faded over the years the way everything eventually fades. She had buried a mate, survived a drought that lasted 3 seasons, and led her people through difficulties that younger Varek could not imagine. She knew what loss felt like. She had worn it many times. But she was not ready to wear it now. She kept thinking about the hatchlings. Their small faces. The way the youngest one, a little male the settlement had started calling Pip because of the small sound he made when startled, always ran to her when the older hatchlings played too rough. The way they all smelled of warm earth and new scales. The way they tumbled over one another in the grass on quiet afternoons while the adults watched from nearby with the particular kind of tired happiness that came from watching the very young be completely alive. She pressed her hand flat against the ground. They were out there somewhere. She could feel it the way she had always been able to feel certain things, deep and wordless, the way old bones feel rain coming before the clouds arrive. The wilderness had not taken them. She did not believe that. She refused to believe it. When the first pale light of morning touched the sky, she stood up, folded her blanket, and walked to the shelter of Doran, her most experienced scout. She knocked twice and waited. Doran appeared at the entrance looking like he had barely slept either. He was a lean and quiet Varek, younger than Mara by many years but already carrying the kind of stillness in his eyes that came from spending long hours alone in the wilderness reading signs that others could not see. He looked at her face and did not ask any questions. He simply said he would get his things. Mara went to 3 more shelters after that. She did not ask for volunteers. She chose carefully, picking the ones she trusted most, the ones who were strong enough for hard terrain and steady enough not to panic if they found something difficult. By the time the sun had fully risen, she had a group of 6, including herself and Doran. The rest of the settlement watched them prepare to leave in silence. Vera, the mother of 2 of the missing hatchlings, stood at the edge of the path with her arms crossed tight over her chest. She did not speak. But when Mara passed her, she reached out and briefly gripped the elder's arm with both hands. Mara covered Vera's hands with her own for just a moment. Then she turned and led the group toward the tree line. They entered the forest from the northern side, which was the direction the storm had come from. Doran moved ahead of the group, his eyes on the ground, reading the mud and the broken branches the way another person might read words on a page. He moved slowly and said little. The others followed his pace without complaint. The forest was still a mess from the storm. Fallen trees blocked the natural paths and the group had to climb over or move around them constantly. The ground was uneven and soft in places, hard and root-crossed in others. Branches that had not fully fallen hung above them at dangerous angles, creaking when the wind moved through. They searched through the morning without finding anything. By midday they had covered more ground than any of the earlier search parties, pushing into areas of the forest that the Varek rarely entered. The trees here were older and taller, the canopy thicker, the light between the trunks thin and greenish. It felt like a different place entirely. Quieter. Older. One of the warriors, a broad-shouldered male named Glenn, suggested they turn back. He said it gently and without argument, simply pointing out that they had brought supplies for one day and the forest ahead looked like it went on for a very long time. He was not wrong, and Mara knew it. She told him to give her 1 more hour. Glenn nodded and said nothing more. They pushed on. The hour passed slowly. The light began to shift as the afternoon settled in, turning the shadows between the trees longer and softer. Mara walked with her jaw set and her eyes moving constantly, looking for anything, a print in the mud, a broken twig at the wrong height, any sign at all that something small had passed through this part of the forest. She was beginning to feel the weight of the morning in her legs and her back when Doran stopped. He stopped so suddenly that the warrior behind him nearly walked into him. He stood completely still with his face lifted slightly, his nostrils working in slow careful movements. The group halted around him without a word. They had all learned long ago that when Doran stopped like that, you stopped too and you waited. The forest was very quiet. Then Doran turned his head slightly to the left. His eyes were focused on something that was not visible, something carried on the air rather than seen with the eyes. He drew a slow breath in through his nose and held it. He said one word. Them. The effect on the group was immediate. Every one of them straightened. Glenn, who had suggested turning back, took a step forward without thinking. One of the younger warriors made a sound low in her throat that she quickly silenced. Mara felt something move through her chest, sharp and bright and almost painful, the way hope feels when it arrives after you have already let it go. Doran began moving to the left, following the scent with careful steps. The group followed him in single file, nobody speaking, nobody making more noise than they had to. The scent was faint, Doran said quietly over his shoulder. Very faint. They had to move slowly or he would lose it. They moved slowly. The trail wound between old trees and across a shallow stretch of rocky ground where a stream had flooded and then receded, leaving pale stones in a wide flat line. On the other side of the stones the trees began to thin. The canopy opened up. The light grew stronger and warmer. And somewhere ahead, carried on the cold and gentle wind that moved through the thinning trees, was the unmistakable warmth scent of Varek young. Alive. Mara pressed her hand to her chest and kept walking. Her eyes were bright and her jaw was still set and she did not allow herself to make a sound. But her hand stayed pressed to her chest the entire way, holding something in that she was not ready to let out yet. Not until she saw them with her own eyes. Doran slowed his pace as the trees thinned further. He held up one hand without turning around and the group behind him stopped immediately. They had all caught it now, not just the scent but something else. A faint smell of wood smoke drifting through the cold air. The smell of something cooked, something warm, sitting underneath the fresher scents of wet bark and damp earth. Doran turned to Mara and spoke very quietly. There was a structure ahead. A small one. He could see the shape of it through the last line of trees. He could see light in the window. A fire was burning inside. Mara stepped up beside him and looked. Through the thinning trees she could make out the shape of a cabin. It was small and rough-looking, built from dark timber, with a low roof and a crooked chimney from which a thin line of gray smoke was rising steadily into the pale afternoon sky. There was a narrow porch at the front with a stack of wood beside the door. The single window facing the forest glowed with the warm amber light of a fire burning inside. She had heard of humans living at the edges of the wilderness. Solitary ones, mostly. Quiet people who kept to themselves and wanted little to do with the wider world. She had never had reason to approach one before. The Varek and the humans in this region had an unspoken agreement that worked best when neither side required anything of the other. But the scent of her young was coming from inside that cabin. She felt the warriors shift behind her. She heard the quiet sound of weapons being drawn. It was not something she stopped. She understood it. They did not know what they were walking toward. A trap was possible. A human who collected creatures was possible. Many things were possible and none of them were good. She drew her own short blade and held it low at her side. She motioned for the group to spread out and approach slowly, keeping low and using the remaining trees as cover until they reached the edge of the clearing. They moved in silence, each one placing their feet with care, avoiding dry leaves and loose stone. Doran moved to the far left, circling toward the side of the cabin. Glenn went to the right. The others filled the space between, advancing in a slow and careful line. They reached the tree line and stopped. The cabin was perhaps 30 feet away across an open clearing. The ground between was soft with recent rain, scattered with wood chips and a few small tools left outside. Everything about the place looked ordinary and worn. Nothing about it looked dangerous. But that meant nothing. Mara had learned a long time ago that danger rarely announced itself. She studied the cabin carefully. The door was closed. The chimney was active. The window was the only opening she could see from this angle, and the glow from inside was steady, not moving the way torchlight moves when someone is walking around. Whoever was in there was still. She looked at Doran across the clearing. He pointed to his nose and then toward the cabin and held up all the fingers of one hand and then two more. 7. The scent of all 7 hatchlings was coming from inside. Mara exhaled through her nose. She motioned the group forward, slow and low, weapons ready. They crossed the clearing in silence, spreading out to surround the cabin on 3 sides. When they reached the walls, Mara pressed her back against the timber beside the window and waited for everyone to get into position. Glenn was at the door. 2 warriors covered the back. Doran was beside her. She looked at him. He gave a single nod. Mara turned and looked through the window. What she saw made her stop breathing. The inside of the cabin was small and simply arranged. A rough table. A shelf with a few items on it. A fireplace along the far wall with a healthy fire burning low and steady, filling the room with warm orange light. On the floor in front of the fireplace, spread across a thick dark blanket, were her hatchlings. All 7 of them. They were sleeping. Deeply, quietly, completely. Their small bodies were curled together in the loose and boneless way that young ones sleep when they feel entirely safe, limbs overlapping, heads resting on one another, soft scales catching the firelight in warm colors. She could see the slow rise and fall of their small chests. She could see that someone had wrapped the injured ones in strips of clean cloth. And there, lying on the floor among them, was a human. He was lean and simply dressed, lying on his side with one arm resting on the blanket near the hatchlings. He was not holding them. He was not restraining them in any way. He was simply there, the way a large and quiet thing is simply there when smaller things have decided it is safe to sleep beside it. 3 of the hatchlings were pressed directly against his side. The smallest one, little Pip, was tucked under the curve of the human's arm with his face buried in the fabric of the man's shirt. The human was asleep. His face was relaxed and still. His breathing was slow. One of his hands lay open on the floor, palm up, the way hands rest when a person has no tension left in them at all. Mara stood at that window and could not move. She had come here with a blade in her hand and fear in her chest and every reasonable expectation that she was about to face something terrible. She had prepared herself for the worst because that was what the situation had seemed to demand. She had held herself together through days of grief and exhaustion and the particular cold weight of hope running out. She had not prepared herself for this. Her blade hand dropped to her side. Then her other hand came up slowly and pressed against her mouth. Her eyes moved from the sleeping hatchlings to the sleeping human and back again, and something in her chest that had been locked tight for days simply came apart. She wept. Not loudly. The sound she made was small and pressed behind her hand, the kind of sound that a person makes when they are trying very hard to stay quiet but the feeling is too large to hold completely. Her shoulders moved. Her eyes filled and spilled over and she did not try to stop it. Doran looked through the window beside her. He made no sound at all but she saw his throat move. Glenn had come around from the door to see what had stopped them. He looked through the glass and stood very still for a long moment. Then his weapon hand came down slowly to his side. He did not say anything either. One by one the warriors came to the window. One by one they looked inside at the warm and quiet room, at their young ones sleeping without fear, at the human lying peacefully among them like something entirely ordinary and right. And one by one, without a single word being spoken, every weapon was lowered. The clearing was completely silent except for the faint sound of the fire inside and the soft and steady breathing of 7 hatchlings who had never once known, in all the warmth and safety of that small cabin, that they had ever been lost at all. Carl woke slowly. The fire had burned down to a steady low glow and the cabin was filled with the quiet warmth that comes in the late hours when everything outside has gone completely still. For a moment he lay where he was, eyes half open, aware of the small warm weights pressed against his side and his back, aware of the soft sounds of breathing that were not his own. Then he became aware of something else. He was not sure what woke him exactly. It was not a sound. It was more like a feeling, the particular feeling of being watched by something very close. The kind of feeling that reaches a person even through deep sleep and pulls them gently but firmly to the surface. He opened his eyes fully. Through the window of the cabin he could see the pale light of early morning. The darkness outside was just beginning to soften at the edges. And in that thin gray light, visible through the glass, were shapes. Large shapes. Still and silent, standing at the edge of the clearing. Carl sat up slowly, careful not to disturb the hatchlings. His movement was quiet, but the feeling in his chest was not quiet at all. His heart had picked up speed in the way it does when the body understands something before the mind has fully caught up. He counted the shapes at the window. Then he looked toward the door and saw more shadows at the sides of the cabin. He was surrounded. He stood up carefully, stepping over the sleeping hatchlings one at a time, and moved to the window. What he saw outside made the breath leave his body in a long slow pull. They were tall. Much taller than him. Broad-shouldered and still, standing in the clearing with the particular stillness of creatures who were very good at waiting. Their eyes caught the faint morning light in the way that large animals' eyes do, bright and steady and fixed entirely on him. Carl had never seen a Varek before. He had heard of them, in the vague and distant way that a person hears of things that exist far from their daily life. Large creatures. Intelligent. Territorial in their own lands but not aggressive beyond them. That was what he had heard. But hearing about something and standing at your own window looking at 6 of them in the gray light of early morning were very different experiences. His hand found the latch of the door without him fully deciding to open it. He stood there for a moment with his hand on the latch and his forehead nearly touching the door. He thought about the hatchlings behind him. He thought about the wounds he had cleaned and the broth they had drunk and the way the smallest one had pressed itself against his side and slept without any fear at all. He thought about what it meant that these large creatures were standing outside his cabin at dawn, silent and still. He lifted the latch and opened the door. The cold morning air came in immediately, sharp and clean. Carl stepped out onto the porch and pulled the door most of the way closed behind him, leaving it open just enough that the warmth from inside would not escape completely. He straightened and looked at the figures in the clearing. For a long moment nobody moved. Then one of them stepped forward. She was older than the others. He could see that immediately. She moved with the kind of deliberate steadiness that comes not from caution but from long experience, the way very old and very capable things move when they have nothing left to prove. Her neck markings were silver and faded. Her eyes were dark and steady and fixed entirely on his face. Carl stood on his porch and held himself still. He kept his hands open at his sides where they could be seen clearly. He did not speak. He had the feeling that speaking was not what this moment needed. The old female stopped a few feet from the bottom of the porch steps. She looked at him for a long moment. He could not read her expression the way he could read a human face, but he could feel the weight of what was passing behind her eyes. It was not anger. It was something older and more complicated than anger. Then she lowered her head. Not a small nod. Not a slight dip of the chin. She lowered her head fully and deeply, bringing it down in a slow and deliberate movement that felt like it had meaning behind every inch of it. She held it there for several seconds before raising it again. Carl did not know what the gesture meant exactly. But he understood it. Some things do not need translation. The body knows respect when it sees it regardless of what shape it arrives in. He stood there. He felt something loosen in his chest and without thinking he dipped his own head in return, slow and genuine. The old female made a sound then. Low and resonant, directed back toward the others in the clearing. Whatever she said caused an immediate response. The warriors behind her lowered their stances. Weapons that Carl had not even fully registered as weapons were put away. The entire group seemed to exhale at once. Then the cabin door pushed open behind Carl. He turned. The hatchlings had woken. They stood in the doorway in a small cluster, blinking in the morning light, their wide eyes moving from Carl to the figures in the clearing. For one suspended second everything was completely still. Then the sounds began. From the clearing came a wave of noise that Carl had no words for. It was not a sound he had ever heard before. It was large and layered and full of something so raw and relieved that it hit him physically, like a warm pressure against his chest. The warriors moved forward and the hatchlings tumbled down the porch steps and the clearing became something extraordinary. Carl stepped back against the cabin wall and watched. The reunions were not orderly. They were not quiet. They were the opposite of both those things. Large Varek dropped to their knees in the mud without any concern for dignity. Hatchlings were gathered up and held against broad chests and the sounds coming from both the adults and the young ones were unlike anything Carl had words to describe. Doran, the lean quiet scout who had found the trail, stood with one hatchling held carefully in both arms and his face pressed to the top of its head and made no sound at all, which somehow said more than any of the others. Little Pip ran straight past all of them. He ran back up the porch steps and pressed himself against Carl's leg and looked up at him with wide dark eyes. Carl looked down at him. Then he crouched down and placed one hand very gently on top of the small creature's head. The old female was watching. She came to the porch steps and looked at Carl crouching there with the small hatchling pressed against him. Then she spoke. Her voice was low and careful and she said one word clearly, as though she wanted to make sure he heard it properly. Rekavar. She pointed at him when she said it. Then she placed her open hand flat against her own chest and said something longer that he could not follow. But one of the younger warriors, standing nearby, spoke in slow and careful human tongue. He said it means the one who stayed. Carl looked at the old female. She was watching him with those dark steady eyes, her head slightly tilted, waiting to see if he understood. He understood. He pressed his own hand flat against his chest the way she had done and repeated the word quietly. Rekavar. It felt strange in his mouth and right at the same time. The old female held his gaze for a moment longer and then dipped her head again, smaller this time, the way you nod at someone when something between you has been settled. Carl stood up slowly and looked out at the clearing. The morning light had grown stronger and warmer while he was not paying attention. The clearing was full of large and small creatures tangled together in the particular comfortable way of things that belonged to one another. The smoke from his chimney rose straight and thin into a sky that had finally, after days of gray, turned a clean and quiet blue. He had lived alone in this cabin for a long time. Long enough that the quiet had stopped feeling like peace and started feeling like something else. Long enough that he had stopped noticing it the way a person stops noticing a sound that never changes. He noticed it now only because it was gone. He leaned against the doorframe of his small and ordinary cabin and watched the clearing and felt something settle in him that had not been settled in a very long time. He was not alone anymore.